Hi, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show right here on VoiceAmericaMedia.com, America's Voice. We're in our 24th year on Voice America Media. I've been on many networks, many different programs, but through all of the different ones, I've stayed with Voice America Media as a constant. And this is the program that shows you how to turn your problems into solutions and your obstacles into opportunities and make your dreams come true. Today, we're talking about a very interesting subject. We're talking about therapy, but more about that, we're talking about the therapeutic relationships that can happen during therapy that aren't always helpful, that sometimes can be harmful. Sometimes we blur our perspective, we blur the lines. And today, our guest is actually going to address that. She's written about it in a new novel, and we're really excited to bring on the program Lucy Ashe. And Lucy's novel really talks about it's a tour de force, and it's about obsession, control, and a dangerous relationship between a therapist and a patient in London in the 1960s. And we'll talk more about that, but the name of the book is The Model Patient, and it engages with themes that continue to resonate powerfully today. And let's talk about Lucy. Lucy Ashe trained at the Royal Ballet School before changing course to study English literature at Oxford University, where she later graduated. She's later qualified as an English and drama teacher. She's written two novels, The Dance of the Dolls and The Sleeping Beauties, and these were inspired by her years in the world of classical dance. Her new book, The Model Patient, marks a powerful evolution in her work, drawing on her personal experience as a therapy patient to explore psychology and the power of trust and self-erasure. A former resident of London, she now lives in the United States, in Brooklyn, and you can log on to lucyashe.com, LucyAshe.com. Welcome, Lucy.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't said much about the novel. Um, it sounds like you've drawn on some of your own experience to write this book. Tell us the premise of the book.
Yeah, so The Model Patient is set in London in the 1960s, and it's about a former fashion model turned housewife called Evelyn Westbrook. And she is having some struggles in her marriage. She had to give up her career as a model in her marriage, and her husband wants her to start trying for a baby, and she's struggling with this. So, at the recommendation of a friend, she starts to go and see a therapist. But in the 1960s, this is not something that everyone just did all the time, as with today. So she keeps this very secret. She's very uncertain about it. But during the kind of early sessions with her therapist, she starts to have a very strong reaction to him. She starts to really respond to him in quite obsessive ways. It's her transference kicking in, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. But she develops this really strong attachment to her therapist. And she struggles to differentiate between what is real and what is not real in their relationship. And these obsessions start to deepen and deepen until she can no longer really unpick reality and fantasy. And the question as you're going through the novel is, to what extent is Evelyn Westbrook really sort of making up the interactions that she's having, or is her therapist actually manipulating her? So the interaction between care and manipulation starts to become very difficult to unravel. The novel it's also about sort of women's lives in the 1960s, and women's lives in their marriages, particularly the early days of the contraceptive pill.
What motivated you to write this?
Yeah, so I don't think I could have written this book if it hadn't been for my own personal experience in therapy. I I started to see a therapist quite a few years ago for anxiety, about some big changes that were coming up in my life. And I think I expected that therapy to be 10 or 20 sessions of talk therapy to really explore some of those upcoming changes. But what happened was I could not possibly have imagined what happened, because it became a very intense relationship with my therapist. And I developed a deep attachment to him that I really struggled to understand. I really struggled to understand the work that we were doing in therapy. It was a psychodynamic therapy, which is a form of psychoanalysis. And the more I would ask, why is this happening? Why am I feeling these very strong feelings about him? I would sometimes feel great rage, sometimes feel great affection. I was having all these different responses, which is, I eventually realized, was a form of transference, which is where you transfer or project patterns from your past onto the relationship with the therapist. And in many ways, that can be a very powerful thing to happen in therapy, and it can become the material of the work that you do. But that requires a really careful, gentle approach, which I didn't feel that was happening in mine. So I was struggling so much with my therapy and why I was having this very intense reaction to it. And the more I asked my therapist to help me with why this was happening, or what was the methodology that we were using, what was this therapy all about, the less he would tell me. So I turned to books, as one does at this time. When something is difficult, I turn to the internet, I turn to research, and I explored more and more about psychodynamic therapy and the history of psychoanalysis. And the more I became interested in it, I suppose it was a kind of fascination, obsession that I was developing. The more I thought, well, actually, this is a really interesting subject for a novel, because of the heart of this conflict being the relationship between a therapist and a patient, and the vulnerabilities of that relationship. I found that it's a very fragile relationship that is supposed to sort of reflect real life, but actually it's not real life. And that I found so interesting that I decided that my next novel was going to be centered around this conflict and this vulnerability.
In your own life, two questions. Did you resolve the relationship with the therapist in your own life? And if so, and how you did it, was that reflected in the story in the book?
That's a really great question. And the therapy, such as the one that I was doing, this psychodynamic therapy, is a long-term therapy, which is not something I understood when I was going into it. That's not something that he had explained to me. And it took 2 years of therapy with him before it started to settle down and to resolve. It also took me leaving a couple of times and then returning for it to resolve. So the relationship did actually settle down. And in the end, I was able to really find trust in the relationship, and to really understand how our relationship could provide this really powerful therapeutic work. But that took, I would say, about 2-3 years to get to that place, which is a really long time to be doing therapy, and to be paying for therapy, and to be also in a place of great conflict about it. But I did persevere with it, partly because the relationship was so compelling, I think, to me, and I was also very dependent on him at that time, so it was very difficult to leave, and my attempts to leave failed both times. But then in the end, I decided I didn't want to. And the novel was written. The first draft of the novel was written during the early, very intense, conflicted year of my therapy relationship. So I wrote it at that time when I felt like I really needed a creative outlet for what I was going through. And the novel gave me this almost, I would say, transformative opportunity to turn all of that conflict and that pain into something that I felt I had a bit more control over. So the novel doesn't actually have that sort of resolution in the therapeutic relationship that I had then experienced going down the line.
Lucy, why the 1960s? Why did you choose that period of time to set the book, The Model Patient?
I think the 1960s, well, I was fascinated by the 1960s for many reasons. I think there was a sort of an aesthetic to it that I was drawn to when I was researching about sort of the fashions, the music, the food. But it was really, I wanted to set the novel at a time of transition, a time of transition that would reflect the transitions that Evelyn is going through in her life. And 1963 is, it's not the swinging 60s yet in London, but it's also not the 1950s. It's that transitional time between the conservatism of the 1950s and the liberalism of the swinging 60s. And Evelyn is exploring her marriage, her identity in that time of great change for women. I also decided that I really wanted it to be a time when there were some big changes happening. So, for example, the contraceptive pill had become available on the National Health Service in the UK in 1961. And Evelyn, my character in The Model Patient, is one of the first women, or she thinks she's one of the first women to have access to this pill. So I set, I guess, the contraceptive pill almost becomes as like a plot point in the novel, that she's taking this, she wants to continue taking it, her husband doesn't want her to be taking it. And I was really interested in the stories of women from that time, of their thoughts about the contraceptive pill, how they could access it, the kinds of barriers there were to accessing it as well.
Did you read about that? Did you read about women in that time period that were going through these kinds of things?
Yeah, it was really interesting because I think I'd had a perception about it that the pill came and everyone could get it, but if that just wasn't the case at all. And there had been a lot of debate in Parliament leading up to the contraceptive pill being granted on the National Health Service, about whether this was leading to a sort of promiscuous society, sex on the state, that sort of thing. Whether taxpayers should be funding this pill that is not medication. I think that was one of the sort of issues for it. It's a medication that it's not for illness, and there was a lot of debate about it. But one thing I found particularly, I guess, troubling that I hadn't realized is that it was completely at the discretion of the doctor in those early years about whether they prescribed this pill. And it was supposed to be only for those women who needed it for health reasons. And the reality was that if you were unmarried, you couldn't get it. If you were married, you probably could, but some doctors required the permission of your husband first before they could
Interesting.
grant the pill. So it was really policed. And I think that idea of something that is supposed to be granting women the autonomy and new rights was actually still so heavily policed in those early years. Felt like an
Was that
interesting.
just in London or was that also in the States?
It was in the UK. In the States, from my research, it was still the case in some states, but not as well. I'm not sure actually. My research was mostly focused on London for this.
Yeah, yeah. But it might have been a little different, or as you said, it might have been just parts of our country.
Yeah, and there was the difference also is that well, the US actually did have access to it earlier, but because there wasn't a national health service in the same way, the medication is obviously granted and given in different
Yeah,
ways in America.
yeah, different. So, I guess my question is, did writing the book, did it change the way that you experienced therapy, or did you write the book after you went through the therapy?
Yeah, I was writing it while I was going through the therapy. So that it was interesting that I had these two very different experiences going on at the same time. So I had the therapy, which I felt was very confusing and emotional and felt very raw and real. And I had these therapy notes that I was writing, sort of journaling, I suppose, between sessions. And if I look back on those, I have looked back on those, and they're kind of wild, really. These notes, and I'm just like sort of thinking about all of the intense conversations that we were having in those sessions, and about my transference, where I was having all these different emotions about my therapist, and about his reactions to those thoughts. So I had that on one side, and then on the other side, I had my novel that I was writing, where every sentence took so long, and it was so, crafted, and loads of research went into it, and I think having those two different ways of exploring really similar material in some ways was really powerful. I'd never experienced anything like that before. I think it makes for a better book because the emotion of the book is very authentic, but also it helped with my own therapy because I was able to gain some understanding of the work that I was doing. I had quite a lot of shame about my feelings in the therapy. So at some moments I would feel this great rage towards my therapist. At other moments I would feel like I wanted him to be some kind of savior who would just fix all my problems. Other moments I had sort of romantic feelings for him as well. And that was so confusing for me, and I felt a lot of shame towards it. And the more I would ask him to sort of explain why does this happen, the less he would tell me. So the book and the research was a way for me to gain some kind of understanding and realize that actually this isn't that unusual. And actually it's important for the therapy work to be able to explore these thoughts.
Yeah, in looking back, Lucy, now that you kind of have the rear view, right? Really seeing the whole thing 2020, do you think that there should have been, or there might have been a different approach to addressing your feelings? Because you've said a couple of times that the response you would get was not satisfying or gratifying, or you wouldn't get a response to how you were feeling. Do you think that's appropriate? Do you think that's a good therapeutic tool? Do you think it's evading the issue? What do you think?
Well, I certainly at the time, and I probably still am, do feel this actually about it, that I didn't feel that it was adequate for the intensity of what I was going through. The nature of the therapeutic style that this therapist used, but still uses, is to be like a kind of blank slate, where you project a lot onto them and you don't really get anything back. But I think there are ways to do that are more supportive and sort of containing, and a way of sort of holding that the vulnerability of that, whereas I was usually faced with a lot of silence, and also very, very cold endings to sessions, where I would have maybe been exploring these different issues, which I always found so difficult to do so, and then it'd be like, time is up, goodbye. And then you're sort of left with this feeling of, did I say the wrong thing? I think this is one thing that I went into the therapy to work on, and it's interesting that it then came up this way, is this sort of fear of getting things wrong, and wanting to, I suppose I wanted to do therapy right. I wanted to be, the model patient in the way that that's explored in the book. And I suppose there is one argument that would say actually that very non-reassuring, sort of reserved, withheld response is putting me in that place of discomfort, which is what I most need to work on, of not seeking reassurance, that sort of thing. But on the other side, on the other hand, I would say that when you're starting therapy and you're exploring for the first time in your life issues from the past that are really difficult or troubling, emotions that you've never had the courage to say before, to then be faced with silence is absolutely devastating. So I think it's about, if I could go back and if I could say to ask my therapist to do it differently, I would say maybe lead up to that type of relationship.
And we're going to take a break, but I want to talk about that a lot when we come back. Is what do you say to a patient for the first time that they're going in? And you just said that. You said, the silence can be devastating. And so we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about, why go into therapy and why it's important. How does it help and how does it not help at times? And we'll also, it's interesting your book is the model patient because you were a model. So there's a lot of, symbolism in that. You're listening to the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show. My guest is Lucy Ashe. She wrote a beautiful novel called The Model Patient. It's about therapy and relationships between therapists and their patients. You're listening again to Positive Living. Stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back. Hi, everyone, and we are back. You are listening to the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show right here on voiceamerica.com, America's Voice. I'm talking with Lucy Ashe, and she is the author of The Model Patient, which this is her third novel. And it's very interesting. It's a psychological tour de force novel about obsession control and the dangerous relationship between a therapist and a patient in 1960s London. And as I said before, Lucy Ashe trained at the Royal Ballet Theatre before changing course to studying literature at Oxford University. And she later was an English and drama teacher. She's written 2 novels. And this marks an evolution, the book, The Model Patient, in her own work, drawing on her own experience as a therapy patient. So welcome back, Lucy. So I have a couple of questions. One of the things that I'm reading in this description, and I want to read it on purpose, is it says, it's a tour de force about obsession, control, and the dangerous relationship between a patient and a therapist. So when I hear you talking about how you leave a session with silence and coldness, I think about therapy differently. And I'd love to get your comments about that of, was that helpful to you in the long run? Was it harmful? And where are you now with this, with therapist and your relationship?
I think the feeling of those, the ending of sessions of that coldness and sort of wanting a feeling of wanting to be reassured, especially after exploring so many difficult things from my past, my current emotions, anxiety, to be left with. I would sometimes use this feeling as I'd go into therapy like as kind of badly knitted jumper, and I'd leave the session like a tangled ball of wool, so completely unraveled. And I did find for the first 2 years of this that it was incredibly harmful, and it was physically harmful as well as mentally harmful, in the sense that it re-triggered an eating disorder from my past, because of the nature of the types of conversations that we were having. For example, I would be struggling with my weight during the session, during that therapy time, and he would say things to me like that. Maybe you don't know what weight to be because you don't know what weight I would find you attractive, and I would be like, well, I don't know how this is helping in to me to get better, and we would have all of these different exchanges where the work became an exploration of the dynamic between us, and I found it really harmful, and painful, and I did eventually leave the therapy relationship. I found another therapist, and I worked a lot on things with this other therapist, a female therapist. But I just
What
couldn't.
was the difference? What was the difference in working with the other therapist?
It was a huge difference. I didn't have any of this transference. I didn't have any of this kind of projecting huge amounts of baggage, I suppose, onto her. But it felt very collaborative. We would explore together the methodologies that we were using before we started any of them. And that I found very helpful. There was also, the ending of the sessions were very different. So we would take 5 minutes at the end to settle, to kind of come back into almost like reality again. Therapy is like this sort of 50-minute moment where you come out of your life, you're reflecting on your life, but you're not in your life in those 50 minutes. And then if it then just cuts off suddenly, it's very jarring to then throw yourself back into real life. So with this female therapist, New York therapist that I was seeing, we would take that time at the end of sessions to really kind of come back into myself, which I found really helpful. But in the end, I did return to the previous therapist. I think
That's interesting.
yeah, it is. And
Interesting.
I've always, it's like, why did I return to something that was actually very harmful for a while? I think it's because I did find it a very powerful method of exploring myself. And once the transference and my reactions to him began to settle, I was able to do, I think, really in-depth work in that therapy. I know
Were the endings the same? Were the kind of cold endings the same when you went back?
No, that was something that we worked on a lot. I was able to really express. I think I found the courage to express exactly what I thought of it, and really worked hard to discuss with him how we could make it different. Whether I can sort of exactly pinpoint how it was different is difficult, but it did become a softer ending. So without sort of reassuring me, without sort of going through, yes, it's all fine, don't you worry. There was none of that, but it was just a sense of, actually, this person is here for me, and they will be here for me the same time next week.
Yeah.
And I feel held in that.
Yeah. Lucy, was any of this reflected in the novel? Kind of this whole differences actually in therapy styles.
Yeah, well, not really in the novel, because the novel is very much focused on this sort of psychoanalytical, psychodynamic style of therapy, which was quite common at that time in the 1950s.
Yes.
The sort of cognitive behavioral therapies were not so common at that time. So that was the focus in the book. But I do find it really interesting to think about the different types of therapy you can go and do. And when I started therapy for the first time, I did not really know any of the differences between them. I think I just thought, I'm just going to do therapy. And I guess I went into it without having done my homework or any research. I don't think I realized I needed to. And I suppose I would, for anyone going into therapy, now looking to, I would recommend researching the different types of therapy and which sounds better for you, because a cognitive behavioral therapy is going to be great if you want to do, 20, 30 sessions working on particular sort of thought pattern changes that can really helping on like reframing thoughts. But if you want to do really in-depth work going back into your past, then it's going to be a longer term therapy. And something like psychodynamic therapy could work for that. But also not all therapists are going to approach that methodology in the same way. So not everyone doing psychodynamic therapy is going to have the same method that my therapist did of really drawing on the dynamic and the relationship between us as the heart of the work, and withholding any of his own thoughts about it, or about the dynamic. So one of the things that I found so difficult is that I felt I was opening myself up completely. I felt like I was sort of just so it's very exposing, and then I really wanted to know what was his response to that. What did he think? And it's really difficult when you don't get a response to that, but in some ways that's probably helpful in the end.
What's your advice to people? If somebody comes to you now and here's this interview, having said everything you said about the style and then changing therapists and then going back and having a little bit of a different style. If somebody's listening to you now and they're saying, I don't know, do you think I should try therapy? I mean, and how do I go to and what should I look for? What would you say, Lucy?
I would say definitely try therapy. It's so important I think for everyone to explore our thought patterns and our relationships, but definitely do some research into what type of therapy you want to do, and have a couple of consultations with a therapist before committing to starting the work, and really ask some questions in those times, those first few sessions, about what will the work look like, what is the therapy framework that you're going to be working within. So some really important questions will be things like, what is your cancellation policy? And I know that sounds like such a basic question, but it can tell you a lot about how a therapist works. So if the therapist has a 24-hour cancellation policy, that seems like a really fair way of being able to sort of be flexible together. Whereas my therapist has a 4-week cancellation policy, which is more challenging, because then you're starting to realize then, okay, well, there's not going to be much flexibility. If I'm unwell or I have a childcare issue, I'm not going to be able to change that. So you want to try and work out how flexible is this person going to be with the way in which we're going to work together. You want to ask about the types of methods of therapy that you're going to use, and also about whether there's going to be any balance between the in-depth work, the kind of emotional work of therapy, and what is sort of called psychoeducation. Is there going to be any moments of sort of stepping out of the intensity of the work and looking almost from the outside in at what you're doing? And I think that it's important that there can be a balance. Too much psychoeducation is not, I don't think, a good idea, because then all of your therapy sessions are being taken over by talking about what is CBT, and you don't really want to do that. But you want a little bit of that to help. I think I wanted a bit of that to help feel grounded and have a sense of understanding of the work I was doing.
Do you think, Lucy, people should do research on the different types of therapy? Because as you said, there are many different types. There's psychotherapy, there's holistic alternatives, there's meditative type of therapy, there's transactional, there's many different types. There's couples therapy. Again, do you think that you should do research and look at the different types?
It's a great question, because, as you say, there are so many types, and how could you possibly research all of it and get a good understanding of it? I wrote this book, for example, from the perspective of a patient. I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, I've got no training in it. So in some ways, I don't think we should expect ourselves as the patients, as the clients, to go in sort of knowing all about the different types of therapies, because of course we're not experts in it at all. So I think there is that feeling of researching it is quite overwhelming. So yes, a little bit of understanding of what the different types are, but without overdoing it. But I would say that the most important aspect of a successful working relationship with a therapist is about the therapist person themselves, like who they are, how they work, as a person, what of themselves do they bring into this, and do you connect with them? And I think you can probably work out within a few sessions whether you have a good connection with a therapist. And if you don't, go with someone else. There are many, many therapists.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, one of the things, I'm going to take a break in a minute, but one of the things I want to ask you about when we come back is the two novels, The Dance of the Dolls and The Sleeping Beauties, and how, is there any crossover between all of these, in terms of the way you write or the stories? So I'd sort of like to talk about that after the break. How can people find you and find the book?
Absolutely. So the model patient it's available in all bookstores right now. And you can find me at Lucy Ashe _author on Instagram. And I've got my website, lucyashe.com as well.
Okay. All right. We're talking with Lucy Ashe, who was trained at the Royal Ballet School before changing course to studying English literature at Oxford University. And her first two novels were Dance of the Dolls and Sleeping Beauties. And this was inspired by her years immersed in classical dance. Now, the book we're talking about today, The Model Patient, marks a powerful evolution in her work, drawing on her personal experience as a therapy patient to explore the psychology of power and trust and self-erasure. And again, the name of the book is The Model Patient. And again, you can certainly go onto her website as well, which is lucyashe.com, LucyAshe.com. All right. And when we come back, we'll talk more about the book and more about, also, we'll talk about writing and how we can use writing to really as a means of self-therapy and also self-healing. So again, you're listening to the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show right here on voiceamericamedia.com. And stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back. Hi, everyone, and we are back. You are listening to the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show right here on voiceamericamedia.com. And we are talking to Lucy Ashe about her new novel, The Model Patient, which talks about obsession, control, and dangerous relationships between therapists and patients, set in 1960s London. It is a novel. Now, welcome back, Lucy. I know you've written two other books, and I'd like to talk about that, The Dance of the Dolls and the Sleeping Beauties, which focused more around the work you did in dance, in classical dance. Talk about the three of them. What do all three of these novels have in common?
The Dance of the Dolls, my first novel, and it's set in 1930s in the world of dance. And in writing that novel, I was returning to the world of dance, to my love of dance that I had let go of, I suppose. And I trained as a dancer. My life was ballet completely. I was at a ballet boarding school as a teenager, so you live and breathe ballet. But then my career hadn't really worked out the way I had wanted to. My body wasn't quite right for it. I was getting injured. So I went to Oxford University and studied English literature, and I really left my ballet behind, but I still loved it so much, but felt a little bit that I had been cast out of that world. I felt I sort of failed in that world. So writing the novel was a risk because it was coming back into ballet somehow, but it was so fulfilling to do so. And the novel was published. It was my debut novel. It did really well, and it was a joy to come back into ballet in a way that worked for me. And the same with The Sleeping Beauties, my second novel. Again, that one is a historical ballet novel set during the Second World War, about a ballet company. So the fact that I was bringing my own personal fascinations, obsessions, loves into those two novels, I think helped with really bringing a kind of authentic feeling into those books. And I was with The Model Patient as well, the fact that I was drawing on my own experience in a conflicted, intense therapeutic relationship. That certainly comes through in the novel. I mean, the novel, The Model Patient, is completely fictional. Nothing that happens to Evelyn Westbrook happened to me. It's a psychological thriller. But there is that same dynamic, that same intensity that I experienced is in the book. So what connects those three books is, I suppose, the fact that I turn to writing as ways to channel feelings, emotions, obsessions, and giving them a sort of structure, and giving those kind of emotions that I don't really know what to do with, that feel almost too big for me. And maybe there's feelings of sadness about the loss of my ballet life. And then I bring that into my writing, and I have a book that I feel very proud of, and I've learned so much along the way.
What would you say to people about writing, Lucy, as a therapeutic tool? Or if they say, well, I'm not sure I know how to write, what would you say?
I think writing is such a therapeutic tool, and to start off with, it should be, I personally think, for yourself rather than thinking about an audience, because if your writing is supposed to be both a therapeutic tool and a book that you're writing to get published for an audience, that can be quite two difficult things to hold at the same time. So if you say to yourself, I don't know how to write, well, actually, that doesn't really matter if you're not planning on necessarily, your first goal is not necessarily to get published. So starting with journaling is so useful. I've journaled my whole life, and yes, I don't think I would ever want anyone to see any of my journals, certainly not. But they're that starting point for kind of finding your own voice in writing. But what has helped me was then moving from journaling to fiction, to writing something that creates a little bit of distance from your own experience. You start with your own experience with the journaling, and then think, actually, is there a way to take all of the sort of the heart of that and put into something completely fictional. And that's one reason, I suppose, why I love writing historical fictions. The Dance of the Dolls was set in the 1930s, and the model patient is the 1960s. And the research that involves and the immersing yourself in that world is therapeutic in itself because of the fascination of doing historical research. But also to provide that little bit of distance from the personal experience. I think that can make a book sharper and better if it's not completely just your own story.
Yeah. And realizing that we draw on history, that maybe times are different and access to some things are more readable or more easily available now, particularly contraception, but there's still the same feelings about it. And so I'd like to ask you about that, about contraception in the 60s versus now, and how that's changed, and what your advice is to people about contraception, just from your own perspective.
Yeah, so when I was researching for the model patient, I was really drawn to the stories that I was hearing about access to contraception, and also people telling me about their experience back then, because the 1960s is not that long ago, and it was interesting to hear perspectives from people about this pill, about actually how it wasn't taken by as many people as we might think, and about how sort of taboo a subject it was. And I really felt as I was writing the book and I was listening to everything that was happening in America, these questions about women's right to their own bodily autonomy, and to question whether women should be allowed their own choice of contraception, just feels like such a terrifying sort of slippery slope to go down. And I did feel this sense of urgency as I was writing it, that this feels so relevant still today. I was hearing stories of mothers not wanting doctors to ask their daughters questions about their menstrual cycle, because of this fear of kind of tracking women's bodies and tracking and controlling their bodily private functions. And that is a feeling that I definitely got into the model patient, where Evelyn is taking this pill and she's worried that her husband is trying to take it away from her, and her parents-in-law as well. And I don't think that is something too far away from what many people experience today. We gained this right, and sometimes we feel that, oh, once we have something, then it's safe, but actually it's not. It's this we constantly need to be reminding ourselves of just how important it is that women continue to have the right to choose how they want to manage their bodies.
Yeah. As you said, it's still a question, even though we don't think it is because it seems so readily available today. But as you said, it's something really to think about, in terms of when you have children and how you have children and what stage of life you want to have children. I think women are thinking about that today more. A lot of women are having children older than younger, right? I mean, that's happening a lot. Talk about how becoming a mother for you reshaped your understanding of identity and vulnerability.
Yeah, it is interesting. While I was writing the model patient, I had no plans to become a mother. Um, I hadn't really thought that I was going to. I was quite certain that my life was going to be my career and writing and my husband. I was really happy with that. And then everything started to change, and I really felt that I did want to be a mother, and my husband, he felt that he did want to be a father, and together we decided this would be the right thing for us. But I was terrified of it all. And I remember when I stopped taking the contraceptive pill and we started trying to get pregnant, I hadn't read a single pregnancy book or, parenting book. I was sort of just, I wasn't really believing that it could happen yet. I think I was almost so frightened of whether I was going to be able to cope with it, even though it was something that I desperately wanted at the same time. And it's interesting how becoming a parent can be that like that. You can have both of those things at the same time, both being kind of terrified, but also desperately wanting it. And then I had my beautiful little girl. She's now 9 months old, and I think one thing that motherhood really has changed for me is that I've been able to hold on to these very large emotions that I think before did not want to touch. If I had a strong feeling about something, it was kind of terrifying for me, and I thought I'd just bury that away. I don't like that. And now as a mother, I just one day I can feel this overwhelming joy, which is almost frightening in itself, and I can hold that and accept that. Another day I can actually find a lot of being a mother quite overwhelming, I'm happy to hold both of those things at the same time, and that's been really helpful for me. I think it's before becoming a mother, I think I needed everything to be either kind of good or bad, or I was happy or I was not happy. And motherhood and all its messiness has allowed me to just sit in that messiness of those emotions much more, which has actually just made me a much more contented person.
Uh, and also that you brought a life into the world. That's also a whole different, right? When you think about that.
Yeah, it's yeah, I know. Sometimes when I sort of look over at her and I think, wow, there's a baby in my apartment. How is this happening? It's such a strange thing, to have brought a little life. And also, so time goes so fast. I think back to 9 months ago when she was born, and it's hard to even remember those first days out of the hospital
Yeah.
and the intensity of that time, and just how quickly time goes.
Yeah.
I think someone said to us before we had a baby that the years go quickly, but the days go slowly. But I don't agree at all. I think the years go quickly, but the days go incredibly quickly as well. And every
Yeah.
day she seems to be doing something new. So it has been a really special time.
Thank you so much. Closing thoughts about the book, The Model Patient. What would you like readers to take away from the book?
Yeah, well, first of all, I hope readers enjoy it. It is it's dark, but it's also a really fun psychological novel. It's got full of twists and turns. I think a novel such as this one, which has an unreliable narrator where you're not sure who to trust, it's a wild, fun reading experience. So I suppose that's what I hope, first of all. But I suppose with slightly more seriously. I write actually in my author's note at the end that this novel is both a love letter to psychotherapy and a criticism of its fragile ethics. And I hope that this novel will encourage people to explore therapy for themselves and not to be frightened of it. Because yes, the relationship in my book is not a healthy therapy relationship, but a good therapy relationship, even one that has been through so many conflicts and very, very stressful, difficult times, such as mine has. A good therapy relationship is just so important for our personal development and our sense of trust in ourselves. And it's a very beautiful thing, a very fragile thing, but a very beautiful thing. So I hope that the book encourages people to explore that, because it is frightening to explore our unconscious lives. I think we all try to bury parts of ourselves that we don't like, parts of ourselves that we want to sort of forget ever existed or keep hidden. But those parts are always there, and it's going to give us more of a fulfilling life to actually explore all parts of ourselves. So I hope the book will encourage people to take that kind of terrifying but exciting step.
Thank you so much, Lucy. Thank you for your transparency, your vulnerability. your eloquent delivery of material and the content. Thank you so much. And folks, you can get the book by lucyashe.com, LucyAshe.com. And the name of the book is The Model Patient. And again, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you so much.
All right, stay on the line for a minute. All right, folks, that wraps up this edition of the Patricia Raskin Positive Living Show. To find me, if you'd like to find out about all these wonderful guests I have on each month, my newsletter comes out the first day of the month. And I'd love to include you so you can see and hear the guests. The guests are also, all of the shows are also archived, so you can hear them live on Mondays and you can also listen later on demand. And contact me, Patricia at patriciaraskin.com, and I'll send you a copy of my newsletter each month. And if you're interested in sharing your positive message and you'd like to create your own podcast series, I've interviewed over 6,000 guest experts in my career, and I'd love to help you do that. So again, Patricia at patriciaraskin.com. Remember, stay healthy, stay happy, get the support you need, and know you can make your dreams come true. Until next time, I'm Patricia Raskin. Bye for now.